Simon's Universal Music, here we are. Believe me, this is the real deal. We're talking about someone who is pretty much pinnacle in the universe, let's say, Jeff. Here I am with Jeff. Yet again, we're going to celebrate the life of George Harrison for his career, his music, and everything he's given to us as fans. So, Jeff.
And his 80th birthday
and his 80th birthday. Month. You know, that's amazing. Where do we start with this, Jeff? I suppose we start with this, when he was on the bus, playing his guitar with John, with Paul.
Yeah.
So, George played Raunchy, yeah, and here we are for the story of...
Yeah, I mean, that's the origin story of the Beatles, because I think you know, Paul already knew at that point. You're right. It's an important moment in music history, because Paul already knew George was a good guitar player. John, who was, you know, older than Paul, was looking at this kid who was, I think, 15 at the time. You know, John was 18, which is light years at that point in your life. Just think back on, you know, when you were 18, if you had a 15-year-old around. But you know, George pulled out this guitar, his shitty Futurama guitar or whatever it was, and played Raunchy and nailed it, as McCartney remembers. And that was, you know, that's the origin story of the Beatles right there, because without those three people, obviously John and Paul would have gone on to some career of some sort, but the alchemy, you know, the chemistry between those three people was such that even before they got Ringo in the band, who sort of, you know, balanced the four corners of the table, you know, when they were just a band with Stu on bass and Stu Sutcliffe on bass and Pete Best on drums, the front line, as we call it in the music business, of those three guys playing guitar and singing was pretty astonishing. So that was, you know, that's the moment where the Beatles sort of came into being in our universe, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's interesting to look at the relationships of the four of them. Certainly, when he joined the band, he knew Paul from school, and there was a, I think he certainly looked up to him, but I think there was a competitive nature to the relationship. Yeah. Whereas as John was old enough and unfamiliar to him that, you know, and John was a relatively enigmatic figure, I'm sure, even at 18. I think that was important. When Ringo joined the band, you know, I think everybody thought they were best friends with Ringo. And I know until the end, George and Ringo were very, very tight. I've talked to Ringo about this a few times. But look, I think as Beatlemania took hold, I think the competitiveness he felt with Paul was crucial. And I also think it worked both ways. I think he had, you know, sometimes sour grapes about it, but also being treated like a kid brother. But I think also, you know, John being that much older, that much more sort of worldly seeming, even in the midst of the Beatles, I think, you know, I think George, in my estimation, always admired John for being John, you know, and I think John was very nurturing of at least in the early days of George's, not just his playing, which blew him away, but his songwriting in a way that I don't think Paul McCartney or George Martin were, certainly not to the same degree. You know, I think things, you know, after they stopped touring and he started to find himself, you know, he sort of caught up to them a little bit age-wise or maturity-wise. I think he absolutely started to break away from those, you know, core relationships and started to see himself as an individual in a way that he hadn't earlier in the Beatles' career. And that, of course, led to, you know, all sorts of ups and downs for the career. I mean, I think he was spurred to write more because he, at first I think he felt intimidated, and then I think he felt like, I'm going to show these guys. So I think it worked. It worked in both senses. It got him going as a songwriter, but then it also spurred him on later in their career. Anyway, that's a long answer to your short question about the relationships.
Totally. And like, what sort of tracks do you think that when you listen to like Beatles songs, of the songs where he made an impact?
Well,
like I love her. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, that's his guitar part.
Yeah.
I think, when George Harrison died, the BBC interviewed Bob Geldof, and he had a great quote. And he said, if you walk down the street of any city and stop a stranger, there you go, Hard Day's Night, and ask them to whistle a George Harrison or whistle a Beatles song, they're going to whistle the George Harrison solo or the guitar part, because they were so, even though the melodies are strong and you might whistle the vocal, when you come to the solo, you're going to whistle the solo. You're going to think of, when you think of And I Love Her, it's not so much the lyrics as that opening riff. I mean, that sets it all up. Day Tripper, any of those songs. And certainly later on, as they had proper solos, there's not a person in the world who doesn't, couldn't hum to you the solo for Something, or, any of those. And I think that's really a testament to his musicality, because look, they recorded most of those songs in a couple of hours, sometimes maybe a day. He was presented with a song he'd never heard before. He figured out what he was going to play, and then when it came to the part, he played a solo that we're still, we can all think in our head of a Beatles song, and we remember that solo note for note. I can't think of any other guitar player in rock and roll history where that's the case. So I think that's, really a testament to not just his guitar playing, but him as a creative person and composer and so forth.
With people in the business that you spoke to, and obviously with this band and with him as an individual guitarist, with him as a musician, do people really look at him to think, what, he was an amazing guitarist? Like he was pretty switched on with what he was doing.
I mean, I think it's hard. I think now that they're so far in the past, we're getting a more historical perspective on them as creative people, because there's now been several generations of fans who are just as rabid about the Beatles as people were in the 60s. I think people are starting to assess them more, and George has been gone for quite a long time. So I think people are starting to assess them more as individuals and their creative contributions. But I think it's also incredibly difficult for, a person like Ringo Starr or George Harrison to get the full respect of certainly your casual fan. They may be their favorite Beatle, but they wouldn't think of them as integral to the sound. I mean, I remember having an argument when I was a teenager with some kids, and basically our idea was, well, John and Paul would have been famous no matter what. They didn't really need George and Ringo. They would have been the Beatles without them. And I actually don't believe that. When I started, when I was in, started to play in bands and started to realize, the sort of give and take and the tug of war that goes on in that creative environment, you realize that the contributions of not just George, but Ringo as well, were crucial to the Beatles. I mean, you take a song like In My Life, that riff that opens it up is really important to setting up the song, and the drum pattern, which is completely bonkers, only Ringo could have thought of. Nobody else in the world would have played that. They just would have played it straight. both of those things elevate the songs to a level of not just being great, but being sort of otherworldly and forever.
I mean, it's great for you to bring up that track, Jeff, because I honestly think that song, In My Life, you know, is right up there as being one of their best songs.
Yeah,
For
absolutely.
definite. For absolute definite. Everything about it. The sounds, the words, everything. You know,
Well,
I can just hear it now.
you got to remember going from, you know, sort of 63, 64, where they were essentially writing pop songs, great pop songs, better than everybody else pop songs,
Yeah.
but pop songs nonetheless. And then in 65, you know, they had Yesterday and In My Life and, you know, a Michelle, and, you know, these aren't necessarily, you know, I mean, Michelle and Yesterday have sort of become, you know, songs that are outside the Beatles, but they still are. If you look at it in their trajectory, they were starting to do things that were far more sophisticated than any of their peers. It was already obvious they were on another level from everybody.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And you know the other thing about George as well, I mean, it's not just about obviously the Fab Four, it's the friendships that he got within the music business. I mean, I love Billy Preston, man. I think Billy is amazing. You know
Yeah.
what an amazing man, and what he gave to us, and having George's friendship with him, you know, and with Eric. I think Eric plays a big part in George's life, and with, you know, the impact on all of that.
Well, look, I think as a guy in the Beatles, it was always nice for George Harrison to have people who respected him. I think within the confines of the Beatles, he was just another Beatle, and he was sort of a junior member for many years, certainly until almost the end. Whereas when he would travel around London or just hang out with Eric Clapton, Eric really revered George as this creative person, and I think he needed that, you know, for his own ego. I think they got along for many reasons. They were the guitar players and so forth, but Eric respected something in George that certainly at that point in his career he could not do, you know. And I think with Billy Preston, you know, Billy Preston was, you know, a working musician who was very well known within the music industry by the time of Let It Be, but it was with Apple Records. You know, George produced his first couple of records, gave him My Sweet Lord, and Isn't It a Pity, and Billy had hits with George Harrison songs. His song was a hit. His version of My Sweet Lord was a hit before George's. So, you know, and George produced that first record, and I believe the second record that had That's the Way God Planned It, which was another huge hit for Billy Preston. And so he set up Billy Preston's career out of just friendship, nothing else. But I think it was good for George Harrison to have people who admired him the way he sort of admired John Lennon, you know, and you know, but you know, there's no doubt about it that he was, you know, he was a Beatle when nobody else was a Beatle. You know, there were only four of them. So if you were Billy Preston or Eric Clapton or whoever he was friends with, that was a very kind of revered, you know, position in society. They were, you know, even to the Stones, they were the Beatles.
Oh, definitely. I mean, when it comes down to talking about the Beatles, and my two favorite Beatles, I'd say, is probably John and George.
Yeah, mine as well. And I love them all. I mean, you know, obviously
of
we
course.
both love them all. But you know, the funny thing about George that I've always thought was, you know, he inhabited this very particular outsider space in the story until the anthology, and then when they filmed the anthology, he took on a persona that was both George Harrison and kind of filling in the gaps, I think, of what John might have said if he had been able to be interviewed at that point. So he was a little more, you know, he was funny the way George was always funny, but he was also a little, you know, sarcastic and sardonic about a lot of the things sort of to kind of level Paul's, sort of, he's always up and always positive. And I think if George felt, I don't know this to be true, but I think he felt it incumbent upon him to bring things back to, reality, that it wasn't all fun and it wasn't all great. And that was what John always did. He was very honest. And I think, George Harrison was always very honest. And look, I wrote a piece for his 75th birthday for NBC News, and I'll post it on social media for people about how in the internet age and the streaming age, George Harrison has become the most popular Beatle. That his songs, Here Comes the Sun, far outstrips Hey Jude and Yesterday and Imagine, and it's a huge song. And it sounds, if you listen to it, Yesterday, it's a great song, and no disrespect to Paul McCartney, but it does sound like it's from another time, whereas Here Comes the Sun could be a modern pop song. It sounds just as fresh today as it did in 1969-70. So I think, there's something about him, and I wrote about this in the article, and I talked to his son, Danny Harrison, about how, he was way ahead of his time. Danny said, on Cloud Nine, he had written about the Devil's Radio, which is essentially paparazzi and, people prying into, his life or everybody's lives. And I think, his perspective was that his dad had experienced, the sort of the Kardashians or the Real Housewives or, TMZ and Perez Hilton 30 or 40 or 50 years before the rest of us. He had been, he had been at a level that like only royalty and presidents had been at. And I think that made an impression on him, and he was able to report on it as a working class guy, unlike royalty or presidents. They can't really complain about that stuff. It's part of the job. He was able to talk about it in very authentic, honest terms, which now we look at and say, wow, this guy got all the drama that's going on with the internet now. He saw it in the 60s. So.
Do you reckon My Sweet Lord will fall into that category? When we talk about something, and like I think My Sweet Lord was under the Guardians of the Galaxy like soundtrack and that. So it's great that you got a song like that, which is I think is quite a commercial, like kind of pop song. Would you say that falls into that category?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think he said to either Ringo or Phil Spector at the time, he just wanted to get the word Hare Krishna on the charts.
Sure.
He had found not necessarily, he had been brought up Catholic, but he had found not necessarily religion, but spirituality after going to India and studying TM and meeting the Maharishi and encountering the Hare Krishnas. And it became really, really crucial to his life. But George Harrison also wrote pop songs. That was the thing. So he was able to blend the two things, his sense of spirituality with a great melody and a great hook and a great pop song. But I think, that's the thing about a song like Imagine or a song like My Sweet Lord is those songs, as catchy as they are, come from deep inside John and George, and that's why they resonate and continue to draw us in, unlike some of the other songs that are just, top 10 hits or whatever. Those are songs that say something and mean something, not just to the guys who wrote them, but to the rest of us.
Definitely. Did you watch that documentary on Phil Spector on Netflix?
I did. Yeah.
Did you ever meet him?
I didn't. Then he said, no, I didn't meet him. I did write a piece that hasn't come out yet about an artist who worked with him, and we can follow up on that next time. But I've talked to many people who worked with him, Jim Keltner and Dion, who made a record with him, and other people, Peter Frampton. And, all of them said they caught him either at his absolute best, when he
Yeah.
was working on like All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band and that, although he had
Yeah.
a pretty serious drinking problem at that time, but the people like Jim Keltner who came and Klaus Vormann who continued to work with him until the mid 70s said he really deteriorated rapidly between sort of 70 and 75 and then kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, he worked, but he wasn't the same Phil Spector after that. But he was
No.
um, I think he was crucial to the making of All Things Must Pass. But
Yeah.
I also think George just needed a bit of a security blanket
Totally.
because I wrote a piece about the making of All Things Must Pass when the box set came out a year ago
Yeah.
for Inside Hook, and I think one of the factors was George had all these songs, and he was going to make a solo record, but I also
Yeah.
think he was used to being in a band and preferred being in a gang. I
Yeah.
mean, the Wilburys were nothing if not a gang. They were the Beatles Mach 2. They were just sort of a gang of George's
Yeah.
friends.
Yeah.
And so he needed a group of people around him and a producer to tell him, keep going, that's great, that's great, that's great. And I think it wasn't until the success of the record and it being a #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic that he felt sort of the burden of the Beatles lifted and the burden of being second fiddle to John and Paul and George
Yeah.
Martin to a certain degree lifted. And I think we thank Phil Spector for that, but also Ringo told me, Peter Frampton told me, and Klaus Vormann and Jim no, not Jim Keltner, but those three, that Phil Spector left, a couple of weeks into the sessions for All Things Must Pass and didn't come back because he was drunk all the time and George
Yeah.
just didn't need him around. I think it was
No.
Ken Scott was the other one who worked on All Things Must Pass as an engineer. So
Yeah.
George knew how to produce a record at that point. He just
Oh,
needed
absolutely.
somebody. Yeah, he just needed somebody to tell him it was great.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great album, and you can listen to it all the way through, and it is probably his best out, his best work.
Sure.
Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely his best solo album. Although
Yeah.
he made some great solo records.
Yes, he did.
But it's his best one. It's his most accessible one. It was significant because it was first. He'd made
Yeah.
Electronic Sounds and Wonderwall music, but those weren't proper solo records.
Sure.
But it was also such a surprise. I mean, I think
Yeah.
when it was a surprise when McCartney made McCartney and Ram because people were disappointed, at least at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Red Rose Speedway and definitely Band on the Run that it was like, oh,
Yeah.
this is what he's capable of. I think nobody was surprised when John Lennon made Plastic Ono Band or Imagine, because he was John Lennon. He was obviously going to make great records.
Totally.
But I think when George Harrison released, I think the proper album without the bonus disc is 17 songs, and
Yeah.
every one is fantastic and different and unique and special and purely George Harrison. I think everybody was, if not surprised, and shocked and amazed that he was capable of such a sustained amount of greatness in one go. So yeah, I think it's shocking. He had certainly done Here Comes the Sun and Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps and
Yeah.
so many Taxman and so many
Yeah.
other songs. But this was just a monumental achievement for any artist.
What do you think about My Guitar Gently Weeps, about that track? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, it's one of the best songs on one of the best Beatles albums.
Yeah.
So even if it's one of those songs that I think all of us have heard probably too many times, but
Yeah.
it never ceases to amaze me when it comes on. I wouldn't probably choose to put it on, but when it does come on, it stops me in my tracks. It's amazing. It would be amazing without Eric Clapton.
Yeah.
But adding that, sort of extra push to it is just you know, because that's Clapton at his best. He became
Sure.
kind of a bore later, but at that point he was Eric Clapton in capital letters.
Sure, because I suppose this is what I do have to say, Jeff. When we talk about George and what he's given the universe, let's say, what I do love is people like George Harrison, and what they give is moments, right? And moments and how you think, moments how your mind works, and when you're doing something. Because it's one thing I can say, right? When I went to Indonesia to visit my best mate Rudders, we went to Bali. And when we was in Bali, we went to this place, like this coffee-like place, right? Where their mate had the beans and like we're doing all of that, and we went to look at it. Then we got the car, we was getting the car home, yeah? We got our iPads out or whatever. It's like, we're gonna put some music. The first track that comes on, ping, that track. And you know what? When it was on, we're out in the sunshine, we're probably having a cigarette out the window, yeah? We didn't say a word to each other, but that Pacific song, at that moment in time, you know, the spiritual thing and how George Harrison works is exactly like that. And I think for me being a fan and having just some kind of moments, I think that makes George Harrison great.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, I mean, certainly the Beatles music, we have so many memories from childhood on wrapped up in those songs. You know, they trigger so much in our memories and our DNA. I think the thing about George Harrison songs for me is, you know, I've heard them just a little bit less than Paul or John songs.
Sure.
So they feel a little bit more, there's still that element of surprise or uniqueness to them that no matter how many times I've heard Here Comes the Sun, I'm always the arrangement and production of that song, which is very modern, never ceases to stop me in my tracks. And I can remember not just one moment, like you're saying, but a dozen moments from my life when that song soundtracked something special or terrible or great or just a beautiful sunny day. That sort of, you know, it can change your mood. And I think the beauty of his songs is because they were, you know, both John and Paul have written about things outside spirituality and whatever. But I think once George found, you know, a spiritual side to himself, that was really what he leaned on. And so the songs maintained that "All You Need Is Love" feeling forever. And I think, you know, to his dying day, he was writing about those same themes, and they really touch us. You know, if you hear that in the right moment, that is really going to affect you as a listener.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, you know who my favorite band is and how I've grown up and the time period of listening to that band and the time period of George Harrison, of what I like. It's Maharishi and all of that, you know, and all the acid and the craziness and everything. But from what I've done, for what I've looked at, he was a bit like, yeah, everyone's doing it, but I'm a bit like, what the fuck is everyone doing? You're a bit crazy, you know? But I love the conservation of what George was into and how he done all of that and the person that he fell into and what he believed in and what his hobbies were and everything. But also, Jeff, I think it's really important to say is his comedy and his sense of humor and all of that, which is probably one of the greatest things that made George an absolutely amazing man.
I've had the pleasure of talking to, I think, all of the former Pythons about their relationship with George Harrison, and it goes way deeper than him just being a fan and paying for the making of Life of Brian. You know, they all got to know him. They all had individual relationships with him. I mean, Eric Idle, he and Eric Idle were very, very close till the very end of George's life. But, you know, Michael Palin, he doesn't talk about it as much, but he was very, very close to George. Terry Gilliam has told me some very funny stories. And John Cleese, who we don't really think of as being friends with George, was very, you know, had some really funny stories too. But I think, you know, the way they talk about him, you know, he always thought they were, you know, they sort of picked up on the Beatles spirit when the Beatles broke up. The Pythons kind of took over, and I get that, I see that. But you know, Michael Palin has said to me, you know, he sort of felt like George was the missing piece of Python. You know, that he fit in, he knew all the skits, and he had the same sensibility and the same. You know, part of it is George, like John, very much, and all of them had a very, you know, didn't give a fuck attitude and a great sense of humor. And I think that was what they saw in each other. And yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt George Harrison was a very, very funny guy. I mean, he's, you know, John was, you know, certainly witty, but often very pointed and a little nasty. I think George could be both. You know, I think he could be that, but he could also be just very lighthearted and funny and quick.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, sometimes I think when people talk about the four individuals and how they were as people within the business, let's say, especially John, right? With John could be, I mean, you probably know more than me, Jeff, but John could probably be an absolute total bastard to people.
I think they all could. That you could, as John said, you couldn't be the Beatles without being the biggest bastards in the world, and I think that's true.
Yeah.
The other guys just hit it a little bit better, but John was tough on the room sometimes.
But you know, George comes across like he was a pretty clever man, and you know, he really wanted to be sarky with you, and you know, he could be that sort of person.
Yes.
You know, which is hey, that's the way it goes, isn't it? Sometimes you just got to, you know, when you want to get to places and how it works, it's important that you have to be that way. But also, Jeff, like the other thing is, you know, he made music with a bunch of people, you know, with Roy, with Dylan, with Jeff, and with Tom, and I think that is truly, you know, a magical group of people that really put something special together.
Yeah, I mean, I think by anybody I've talked to about George Harrison, the thing they talk about is what a great collaborator was. And I think, you know, I think John was very comfortable being a front man, and Paul is very comfortable being a front man. And I think, you know, George Harrison loved being in a gang, even after, you know, if you look at his solo album, certainly in the 70s, it's always the same people over and over. You know, it's Jim Keltner and Klaus Forman and Ringo, and you know, Jesse Davis. You know, he used the same people. He liked to have a gang, and one of the things I talked about, certainly with both Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty, was that, you know, George was happiest when he had his guys around him, when he had his friends. It was as much about being a gang of guys against the world as it was making music. And I think that's really important to making great music and being happy as a creative person, as a musician, is doing it for those right reasons, doing it for the sake of having fun with a group of guys or women or whoever it is. I think that was really crucial to him.
And his style and his fashion, you know, that goes just the same as you know, John and Paul and Ringo. You know, George's look, you know, his hair, his style, and that. I think that's important as well.
Yeah. Well, they invented the look of the modern rock star in so many ways. Certainly them and Dylan in the mid-60s were just so well dressed all the time. They had all the money in the world. They were constantly on camera. They always had to look a certain way. And I think they adopted that in life. They certainly, all of them wore some terrible outfits, but they were often way ahead of their time. And also, even though they were ahead of their time, there was a classic, you look at most of the looks the Beatles wore throughout their careers, not just as the Beatles.
Yeah.
They really, we're still dressing like them today. I mean,
Yeah.
many of the artists dress the same way. I was joking with somebody the other day that I saw a picture of John Lennon in 1979 dressed a certain way, and I've dressed that way since I was 13, so it's like, it's kind of like they inform so much of the culture, not just the sound and spirituality and bringing yoga and transcendental meditation and Maharishi and Ravi Shankar and all these things that the Beatles and George Harrison introduced us to, but the way we look and interact with the world, that kind of, I mean, certainly Elvis and James Dean and Marlon Brando had that don't give a fuck attitude, but the Beatles were the ones who did it in a way that was less threatening.
Yeah.
And with humor. And I think that was the thing that they gave us. Everybody, it's devolved certainly with the internet and Twitter and all these other things, social media. But I think certainly there was a golden age sort of, from the Beatles up until the 90s where they really informed the way we all interacted.
Sure. Would you say, this is totally off the radar, and it's something that I haven't thought about too now, but it's something that I have to ask. So here we are in 2023, right? And we're talking about, an incredible man that was in that band. But that incredible band made a huge impact in the United States of America. Do people have the same sort of perception as the Beatles? Are youngsters aware that these four English guys came over and caused craziness?
It's hard for me to know. I mean, I think the reality is successive generations pick up on the Beatles' music above all else. I don't know if they know the stories or the legends and myths or the individual personalities. I don't know that they know the narrative of the Beatles, sort of 8 years in the public eye so well. But I don't think, I think they're interchangeable in many respects. But I do think that they, that because the music keeps resonating, there will always, and resonates with so many millions of people, that there's always going to be a healthy dose of Beatles fans who know the whole story and are obsessive about the whole story, because they are, if you become a music fan and you become an obsessive music fan, it becomes obvious to you very early on that no matter who you fall in love with, they owe a debt to the Beatles in some respect.
Yeah.
And I say this with all due respect, even to country artists or rap artists, hip hop, whatever, dance music, that they all, if you dig down on their influences, they all know and love the Beatles. And I think as young people, I found Little Richard and Chuck Berry and the Everly Brothers and Roy Orbison, in many respects from the Beatles and Elvis. And so I think as young people discover their own music and find that their favorite artists were influenced by this group, they go back, and the most obsessive of them will want to know the whole story, because it's a perfect story, unlike the Stones, who are still going and are amazing, or sort of Zeppelin or Queen or even Elvis or Bob Dylan. The story of the Beatles, the way they happened and so many happy accidents, and then that 62 to 70 period was just so magical. And so much consistently great music and so many groundbreaking events in their careers, playing stadiums first, touring the world in ways that nobody had ever done before. They set the template for the modern rock star in many, many ways. I think there'll always be people discovering that.
Definitely.
I think that's true. I think that's true in America, the UK, wherever,
Yeah. I mean, you know, I can only go through my own story, and you know where I come from and what I love and everything, right?
Sure. We've done this a few times. Yeah, I know
Yeah,
your
yeah,
life
yeah.
story.
Sure, absolutely. But when I first started work, you know, when I left school at 16, okay, and I went into work, and when I started picking up some money, and you wanted to start getting your music collection going, what was happening and to what was the influence, you know, it was that, Jeff. It was, you know, I paid 16 quid for that, yeah, and that was the first
You got your
one.
money's worth.
I got my money's worth, you know, and I think that album has had one of the biggest impacts in my life
Sure,
on all of this, you
sure.
know, and the sound and everything, and what came from George on that album, incredible. I listened to Day in the Life, you know, and I think that is just mega,
Yeah,
absolutely mega,
yeah,
unreal.
yeah, yeah. I
Like,
agree. I 100% agree. Yeah.
but for what George Harrison has given the universe, Jeff, I think it's absolutely phenomenal.
Well, and think about it in these terms. For many, many, many years, including, I that's an OG CD. I remember that one with the slipcase.
Yeah,
That you probably got that like 87, somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s. You know,
yeah,
that Within You Without You was the track whatever he contributed to the other songs, Within You Without You was a track that many people skipped for many years. And now we realize that, what we call world music, he was way ahead of the rest of the universe.
oh,
And
absolutely,
it's no
absolutely.
longer a song that people skip. It's a song
Yeah,
that people appreciate. So if that song is now 60, almost 60 years old, and
sure.
people are just now coming to appreciate how great it was. Even
Yeah,
George Martin didn't love it. He just sort of indulged George. And
yeah,
it's one of the high watermarks on that record, which was ignored for many years. So
definitely, definitely.
yeah.
And I have to show you this as well, right? So when I lived in Bromsgrove in the heydays, yeah, there's like that picture. Can you
Oh
see
wow,
it?
that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think I finished work one time, right, and I was just puttering about, and I saw that, and I was just like, "Ooh, that looks pretty good.
Gotta have
I'm
that.
gonna get. I'm gonna. I think it was only like 25 quid or whatever it
Wow,
was.
that's amazing.
But you
Yeah.
know what? Having that photograph,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
of that look and that time period with
Yeah.
Dan, with obviously the sound period, it's just it.
Well, look,
it
I I
sure.
have some version or other of every famous guitar George played.
Yeah,
I've got
that
the
one.
Rocky behind me.
Yeah,
The 6120 was one he played in the Wilburys and the Carl
yeah,
Perkins show.
yeah,
I've got my a Duo Jet, a Rosewood Telecaster. All the guitars he loved. I bought not just because they had a connection to George Harrison, but
yeah,
because they sound great and you can do so much on them.
yeah,
And, so a lot of guitars I'll get and then I'll get rid of them because they don't sort of speak to me. All the guitars he chose were guitars that, like it had a meaning for me beyond just the photo. It sort of spoke to me in a more meaningful way for whatever reason. We don't know.
yeah. I wonder how often he played. I wonder how he just worked it out.
Yeah.
I
I
just
think later in life, I mean, his son Danny told me that later in life he walked around the house playing the ukulele all day, which I also
yeah,
have a ukulele. So I mean, it's like he made a huge impact on my life. But uh, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the thing about the Beatles was they were working so much that you know he became a better and better player because they were playing so much. But then when the
yeah,
Beatles ended, he developed that slide style, and that's probably what most musicians associate with George Harrison is his
yeah,
slide playing, and yet he barely played the slide guitar in the Beatles.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that was something that came later.
He made great music videos,
He
right?
did. He
He
did.
made great music videos. And you know what video I love? Crackabot Palace.
Oh, great. Directed
And
by my old friend, frenemy Eric Idle. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right, no way. Oh, I mean, I have no idea what's happened. Do they still own that? Do you know?
The
The
estate?
Harrison. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, yeah. They've I believe collected pretty much everything.
right. So the Harrison family still own Crackabot Palace.
Oh, the house, the Friar
Yeah,
Park. Yeah, they do. They do own that.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Because when you look at that, that looks an incredible kind of place.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it was really a testament to George's worldview. It's such a kooky, it's a castle
yeah,
befitting George Harrison, but it's
yeah,
also this kooky place with all these weird statues and, you know,
yeah,
a moat and a swamp and a bridges and tunnels and gnomes and
yeah,
everything
yeah,
else and these
yeah,
weird sayings on carved in the stone. So I think it's a, you know, it's very representative of who he was as a person and his ethos. Yeah.
yeah. I've I don't quite know the full story to this, but I've got a friend who I used to work with. Her husband used to be a singer in some kind of band in Birmingham in the 60s, right?
Okay.
Who knew Jeff Lynne,
Oh
okay?
yeah.
With him being mates with like Jeff Lynne, they went to George's place, right?
Interesting.
And was sat having tea and whatever, and George had this like vegetable pack and like was growing like cauliflowers that were probably about, you know, that kind of size. And like he had photos of it. I haven't seen the photos, but he was like saying he had photos and this, that, and the other. But you know, he liked growing all his veg and like all you
Yeah.
know,
I mean,
growing all
I think it's no secret George was a gardener.
he was a gardener. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He really loved it, didn't he?
Well, I think after the Beatles, there are many ways to fill your time. And, you know, certainly Paul continues to make music to this day. Ringo
Yeah,
continues to make music to this day. But I
yeah,
think you have to have other pursuits. And I think, you know, in many respects, I think George felt like he'd done it all. And, you know, if he occasionally wanted to dip into the business, he could and enjoy it. But he needed to find other things to fill his time. And the thing that spoke to him, you know, when he bought Friar Park, it had been a nunnery for many years and was falling
sure.
apart.
Yeah,
And he poured money into the house first, but then he had these acres and acres of land. And I think he poured the rest of his time and efforts to rehabilitating that house into the property itself. You
yeah,
know, built a, I think he moved the lake and he, you know, planted trees. And, you know,
yeah.
his son told me a story about, you know, he would be out there in the dark, you know, digging in the dirt, you know, working in the
Yeah, yeah,
garden,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because he loved it so much. And it was meaningful for, he found, you know, I think peace in doing that. And certainly he deserved that.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it was really good. And you know, when you say like Ringo's still making music and that, do you know what? I was gonna say this. The four of them and not being in that band, yeah, I still listen to their solos. I listen to Ringo stuff. I
Yeah, of
listen to
course.
Ringo stuff. I listen to McCartney. Obviously, you know I listen to John.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, all of they're just hey, are they the best of all time?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think even as individuals, they made great music. There maybe the peaks, or it wasn't as consistently great, but there's not an album that any of them have released, even Ringo the Fourth, that doesn't have some enjoyable tracks, or Bad
Yeah,
Boy that doesn't have
yeah,
some enjoyable tracks on it. You know, I was read an article the other day about Paul McCartney's "Give My Regards to Broad Street" and how it's an album that never should have been made. And I'm like, there's 3 songs on that album that I really love,
yeah,
and they're maybe not the greatest Paul McCartney songs, but they're songs I really love. So
yeah,
without that album, those songs maybe wouldn't exist if it gotten released. You know, so you know, there's always, there's always beauty and amazing musical moments to find in everything those guys did. They were just, we're very fortunate to have their catalog and all the solo, they have lots and lots and lots of solo music.
Yeah.
And you can take it, and make Beatles records with the best of it. So you can sort of, like take 1973 and just pick the 14 best songs and four from each of them, and you've got your own little Beatles playlist. So it's which is fun to do, and I've done it more than one time on the internet for people. So I mean, look, they're the Beatles, and there's everybody else. That's the reality of it.
So what you got planned for your show that you're going to do this week?
Yeah, well, it came up very surprisingly. We hadn't been booked to do a show. It wasn't planned at all. We have a schedule of shows we do. We had done our Bowie show in December, and we were going to do a Dylan show in May, and I had other shows planned, but the people were complaining that we weren't doing a show at our regular residency till May, and the club approached us and said, is there another date you have in mind? And I noticed that George's actual 80th birthday fell on a Friday night.
Yeah.
So I said, well, we could do something for George's birthday. This is just about a week or two ago.
Right.
And they were like, great, let's do that.
Yeah.
So then it became, there's probably over the course of the this current band's career, which is about 10 years now, or certainly more than 5, I think we've only played 6 or 8 George tunes, and only a few regularly. Yeah. So you need to fill a whole night. So we just went through and picked out our favorites. There's only a couple of Beatles songs. It's a lot of his solo music. Some kind of oddball choices, a bunch of stuff from All Things Must Pass.
Yeah.
Some Wilbury songs. But like it's fun to do a show like that because you can I really wanted to do Old Brown Shoe, which is a B-side to Ballad of John and Yoko, not a big Beatles track. And at first the band was like, I don't know. And I found a great live version of it, and everybody was like, oh yeah, let's do this song. It's a great song. So there's surprises even in George Harrison's catalog. There's songs that are surprises.
Definitely. That's really good.
Yep.
So
and I get to break out my ukulele.
Well, there you go. That can't be bad, can it?
No, not at all.
So what's been happening with yourself? What you got planned at the minute?
Well, my single from last year, The Poacher, is over 100,000 plays on Spotify, which is amazing to me.
Yeah.
The album is finished. It's going to be coming out later this year. We don't know exactly when. I'll be over to the UK to do some shows.
Yeah.
I have a single coming out, I think, in May.
Right.
That Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics produced. So that's big news.
Yeah.
Or co-produced and plays on.
Yeah.
The guys in Weller's band and Noel's band, and everybody played on this, and Earl Slick is on it as well, and some of the Heartbreakers. So it's a star-studded album, and I'm really happy with it. We're already working on the next one. Yeah. But I'm playing a lot of shows. We're doing festivals in May and August and October, and so a lot of travel and a lot of playing and opening for people, and sort of the usual stuff. So just really looking forward to that.
That's good. And you're coming to Britain.
I am. I'm definitely coming to do some promotion for the single in the late spring or early summer, and then once the album's out, I will absolutely be there to play.
Cool. And we will be there.
I know we're already doing like an unplugged night and a full band night in London. Definitely playing Liverpool. I'm not sure where else, but you will be the first to know.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant. That's really, really good.
Can't wait. It's been a long time. I haven't been there to tour properly since, certainly in more than 10 years. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've obviously all been sort of back to normal now in 2023, where people are obviously getting out and about and, wanting to move forward and do everything. it's
Yeah.
nice to see it all happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. Well, happy birthday, George Harrison.
Happy
80th.
birthday, George Harrison. Happy birthday, George Harrison.